April 16th, 1746. Culloden Moor, Scotland. It's early morning. Not dawn, past dawn. The sky is that flat, heavy, charcoal grey that means no sunrise is coming, just more grey, more cold. It's sleeting, not the dramatic driving sleet of a proper Highland storm, just that miserable, persistent, horizontal wet that Scotland does so well. The kind that gets in your eyes, down the back of your collar, and soaks through everything, and still keeps coming. We have a word for it, as you'll know from last week. Dreich. Today is dreich, in every possible sense of the word. The ground is boggy, and that matters, remember that. The ground is soft and wet and uneven, not the firm, dry battlefield you'd choose for a fight, the kind of ground that will grab at your feet as you run, the kind of ground that will slow you down precisely when you cannot afford to be slowed. On one side of this flat, exposed, treeless moor, around 8,000 government troops, well fed, well rested. They slept last night, properly slept, in camp, with food in their bellies. Professionally trained soldiers with muskets, artillery and cavalry, commanded by the Duke of Cumberland, 25 years old, ruthless and absolutely certain of what is about to happen. On the other side, around 5,000 Jacobite men. Let me tell you what those 5,000 men have just been through. The night before, the night of the 15th, they attempted a surprise attack on the government camp. They marched in the dark, in silence, for almost 12 miles, through the night trying to reach Cumberland's camp before dawn for a night assault that might, just might, change everything. They got lost. They wandered in the dark for hours, and by the time it was clear the assault had failed, they'd covered almost 12 miles of rough ground for nothing, and dawn was breaking. There was nothing to do but turn around and walk back, almost 12 miles back. Some of these men had not eaten properly in 2 days. Some had eaten nothing at all. They arrived back at Culloden in the early hours of the morning. Most of them collapsed where they stood and slept. Not in beds, not in shelter, but on the ground, in the cold. An hour later, maybe two, they were woken up. Cumberland's army was advancing. So that is what was standing on the Jacobite side of Culloden Moor. 5,000 men, cold, soaking wet, some of them still barely awake, hungry, many of them having just walked almost 24 miles through the night for nothing. And their commander, Bonnie Prince Charlie, has ordered them to stand and fight, here, now, on this ground, against this army. His senior general, Lord George Murray, one of the finest military minds in Scotland, a man who has been right about almost every tactical decision of the entire campaign, looked at this flat, open, boggy moor, looked at Cumberland's forces and said, "Not here, not this ground, we cannot win here." He was overruled. In 60 minutes, it will all be over. Hello and welcome back to Everything Scotland. I'm Lesley Kennedy and today, the Jacobites. Scotland's most romantic, most heartbreaking, most complicated lost cause. Get comfortable. This one's a story. Before we go anywhere near that battlefield, I think I need to give you the background, because nothing about this story makes sense without understanding what the Jacobites were fighting for, and why so many people were willing to die for it. The word Jacobite comes from Jacobus, the Latin for James, and it all starts with a king called James. James II of England, who was also James VII of Scotland, because Scotland and England were separate kingdoms that happened to share a monarch, came to the throne in 1685, and almost immediately he started making people extremely nervous. James was Catholic, in a country that had been Protestant for over a century, in a country that had fought and bled over religion for generations. This was not a small thing. People were worried. And then James started doing things that made the worry worse, appointing Catholics to positions of power, suspending laws that had been designed to keep Catholics out of public life, generally behaving as though he intended to undo the Protestant settlement that England and Scotland had spent decades establishing. Parliament watched all of this and made a decision, a very significant decision. They decided they would rather have a different king. So, in 1688, they invited William of Orange, a Dutch Protestant married to James's own daughter Mary, to come to England and take the throne. William arrived with an army. James, seeing the way things were going, fled to France. This event is called the Glorious Revolution. Glorious, presumably, if you were on the winning side, less so if you were James. James went to France, was welcomed by the French king, Louis XIV, and spent the rest of his life trying to get back. He never succeeded, and he died in exile in 1701. But his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, kept the claim alive, and his grandson after him. And the people who supported this claim, who believed the Stuarts were the rightful monarchs and what had happened in 1688 was an illegal coup, were the Jacobites. For 60 years after 1688, the Jacobites never stopped trying. There were 3 serious attempts to restore the Stuarts to the throne. The first was the Rising of 1715, or the 15 as it's known. James Francis Edward Stuart himself came to Scotland. Support rose across the Highlands and into northern England. For a few months it looked possible. Then the leadership faltered. The English Jacobites didn't rise in the numbers expected, and the whole thing collapsed. James sailed back to France. The 15 was over. The second was the Rising of 1719. Smaller, Spanish-backed, ended in a single skirmish at Glenshiel in the Western Highlands. A footnote, almost, except for the people who died in it. And then, 26 years later, the third attempt, the one that matters, the one that came so close that it still feels, 300 years later, like it could have gone the other way. The Rising of 1745, the 45, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Charles Edward Stuart was born in Rome in 1720. He was Italian on his mother's side and educated in France. He had never been to Scotland in his life. He spoke English with an accent. He spoke French fluently. He was young, charming, and absolutely convinced, with the unshakable certainty of someone who has grown up being told they are destined for greatness, that if he could just get to Scotland, the clans would rise for him. In the summer of 1745, at the age of 24, he decided to find out if he was right. He sailed from France with 7 men, 7 companions, a ship, and the audacity of someone who genuinely believed that the throne of Britain was rightfully his, and that the people of Scotland were going to help him take it back. The extraordinary thing is, they did. Charlie landed at Eriskay, a tiny island in the Outer Hebrides, in late July 1745. A local clan chief came to meet him, took one look at this young man with his 7 companions and his impossible plan, and told him, very bluntly, to go home. Charlie's reply, according to legend, was, "I am come home." 3 weeks later, against the mountainous backdrop of Glenshiel, with the Great Glen stretching in the distance, the Jacobite standard was raised at Glenfinnan. Not everyone came willingly. Cameron of Lochiel, known as Gentle Lochiel, one of the most respected clan chiefs in the Highlands, had deep reservations. He knew the risks. He knew what failure would mean. He rode to meet Charlie, intending to talk him out of it, intending to go home and stay neutral. He came away having pledged 800 men. This is the measure of Charlie's charm, and also perhaps the pull of the cause. Something about this young man in this moment made people believe it was possible, even people who knew better. What followed was, for a few astonishing months, brilliant. The Jacobite army captured Edinburgh in September 1745, almost without resistance. The city gates were opened before they arrived. Charlie held court in the palace of Holyrood House, like a king already. Then came the Battle of Prestonpans, east of Edinburgh, fought on the 21st of September. The government army was destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. The whole thing lasted approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes. The Highland charge, screaming men running full tilt with broadswords, hit the government line before they properly formed, and it was over before most of the government soldiers even knew what had happened. And then they marched south, into England. This is the part that people sometimes forget. The Jacobite army invaded England. They crossed the border in November 1745, took Charlie, moved through Lancashire, and by early December they were in Derby. 130 miles from London, closer to the capital than the army had been just weeks before, closer than any invading force had come since William the Conqueror in 1066. In London, the reaction was panic. George II, the Hanoverian king, was reportedly packing his bags, preparing to flee back to Germany. The Bank of England started paying out in sixpences to slow the run on its reserves. The theatres closed. The city waited. And then, on the 5th of December 1745, the Jacobite army held a council of war in a house in Derby. On one side of that argument, Charlie, push on, we are here, we are closer than we have ever been, London is in panic, the English Jacobites will rise when they see us coming, we cannot stop now. On the other side, the clan chiefs and Lord George Murray. Look at the facts, we have around 5,000 men, the government has recalled armies from Europe. There are 30,000 soldiers between us and London. The English Jacobites have not risen. The French support we were promised has not arrived. If we advance, we will be destroyed. Charlie argued, he pleaded, he reportedly wept. The chiefs voted to retreat. Charlie never forgave them for it. And many historians argue, still argue to this day, that the chiefs were wrong. That London was there for the taking, that panic was making decisions for the government that 5,000 Highland swords could have confirmed. We'll never know. What we do know is that the army that had been advancing, winning, advancing and winning turned north. And armies that turn back are different armies from the ones that were advancing. The momentum was gone. The confidence was seeping away with every mile retreated. And behind them, catching up, methodical and well supplied, Cumberland's forces. By April 1746, it had come down to a moor near Inverness. It had come down to Culloden. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 16th of April 1746, the government artillery opened fire on the Jacobite lines. And the Highlanders stood and they took it. They couldn't charge yet, the order hadn't come. And so, for somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes, accounts vary, but the time was real, the time was long. Cannonballs tore through the Jacobite ranks, and they stood there, in the sleet, on the boggy ground, while men around them died. Think about what that means. Think about what is being asked of those men. They are exhausted, they are cold, they are hungry. They marched 24 miles through the night for nothing and slept for 2 hours on the cold ground. And now they are standing still in a line while artillery fires into them. And they cannot do the one thing that Highland warriors were trained and bred and famous for, which is move. They stood because honour and discipline said you stood. You did not break, you did not run, you waited for the order. Finally, the order came. The Highland charge. The battle tactic that had won Preston Pans, that had terrified armies across Europe for generations. 5,000 men at full sprint, screaming, broadswords raised, covering ground at extraordinary speed. It was terrifying under normal circumstances. But the ground was wrong. The boggy, soft ground grabbed at their feet as they ran. The charge that should have covered the distance in seconds took longer, ragged instead of cohesive, and the government army had prepared specifically for this moment. New tactics, a new way of using bayonets that meant each soldier protected not himself but the man to his right. Volley fire, organised, sequential, disciplined. Load, fire, step, reload, fire. Not one volley, but continuous volleys, wave after wave. The charge hit the government line and broke. Then the cavalry swept in from the flanks. The Battle of Culloden lasted less than 60 minutes. Around 1,500 Jacobites were killed in the battle and in the immediate pursuit across the moor. The government lost perhaps 50 men. And then it got worse. Much worse. Cumberland gave orders that are still argued about today. His cavalry and infantry pursued the fleeing Jacobites for miles across moor and beyond. Men who had thrown down their weapons and were clearly running away were cut down. Wounded men on the battlefield were killed where they lay. Houses in the surrounding area where Jacobites had taken shelter were burned. In the days and weeks that followed, his troops swept through the Highlands. Farms were burned, cattle were taken. Men suspected of Jacobite sympathies were killed without trial. Women and children were left homeless in the April cold. They called him Butcher Cumberland. They still do in Scotland. His name has never been rehabilitated here, and in my personal view, it never should be. What happened after Culloden was not the conduct of war, it was the systematic destruction of a people, and that was only just the beginning. The Battle of Culloden was the last battle fought on British soil. It was over in less than an hour, and it ended not just a campaign, but an entire way of life. Charlie escaped, which is the first thing to say, and the thing that many Scots have complicated feelings about. The men who followed him mostly did not escape, but Charlie did. For 5 months after Culloden, the prince was a fugitive, hiding in the Highlands and Islands, moving from house to house, from cave to hillside to boat. There was a price of £30,000 on his head, an enormous sum, more money than most ordinary Highland people would see in their entire lives. No one claimed it. I find that extraordinary every time I think about it. Hundreds of people knew where he was. Hundreds of people who were cold and hungry and whose world had just been destroyed sheltered this man at enormous personal risk and said nothing. That is a remarkable thing about the Scottish character, I think. A loyalty that holds even when it costs everything. The most famous episode of Charlie's flight involves Flora MacDonald. And this story deserves to be told properly because Flora is one of the most remarkable people in Scottish history, and she is sometimes reduced to a footnote in Charlie's story. She shouldn't be. She is the story. Flora was 24 years old, the same age as Charlie, from South Uist in the Outer Hebrides. She was not a Jacobite fanatic. She was a young woman who was asked to do something dangerous by people she trusted, and she agreed. The plan was this. Charlie would be disguised as Flora's Irish spinning maid, a woman called Betty Burke, and they would travel together by boat to Skye, where other arrangements could then be made. Now, Charles Edward Stewart was 6 feet tall. He was broad-shouldered. He had a 5 o'clock shadow. He was, by all accounts, not a convincing Irish maidservant. Contemporary accounts suggest he kept forgetting to walk like a woman, striding ahead when he should have been demurely following, lifting his skirts too high when crossing streams. At one point, government soldiers stopped the boat and questioned him. They questioned Betty Burke. They were, apparently, satisfied, and they let them past. And they made it to Skye. Flora was later arrested, taken to London, imprisoned, initially on a ship in the Thames, then in the Tower of London. And here is where her story takes a remarkable turn. She became a celebrity. People in London rowed out to the prison ships just to catch a glimpse of this brave young Highland woman. She received gifts, she received visitors. She was treated by her jailers with great courtesy because public opinion had made treating her badly politically unacceptable. She was released in 1747 under a general amnesty, returned to Scotland. Eventually, she emigrated to America, to North Carolina, where there was a large Scottish community. And then the American Revolution broke out, and Flora and her husband, being loyal to the crown they knew, found himself on the loyalist side and had to flee back to Scotland. She came home to Skye, and she died there in 1790, aged 68, having lived one of the most extraordinary lives of the 18th century. She's buried at Kilmuir on the Trotternish Peninsula. And Charlie, well, he made it to France. He was 25 years old and the most famous fugitive in Europe, and he had the rest of his life still to live. He lived for another 42 years, and they were not kind years. The dashing prince of the 45, the young man who had raised the standard at Glenfinnan and marched to Derby, became, gradually, a disappointed exile. He drank heavily, his marriage was unhappy, the French support he had always counted on never materialised. The cause he had dedicated his life to slipped further away with every passing year. He died in Rome in 1788. He was 67 years old. He never came back to Scotland. He never came close to the throne he had spent his life believing was rightfully his. Back in Scotland, after Culloden, the consequences were devastating. The Disarming Act stripped Highlanders of their weapons, swords, dirks, firearms, the tools of the culture as well as the instruments of war. The Dress Act banned Highland dress, kilts, tartans, plaids, all of it. For 35 years, it was illegal to wear traditional Highland clothing in Scotland. 35 years. Think about what that means. A whole generation growing up unable to wear what their parents and grandparents wore. A visible, daily erasure of identity. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act stripped clan chiefs of their legal powers, transforming them overnight from patriarchs with responsibilities to their people into landlords with rights over their land. The people who had lived on that land for generations became, legally, simply tenants, and tenants could be moved. And so began the Highland clearances, which we'll talk about in full in a later episode, but the seed was planted here, on Culloden Moor, on the 16th of April, 1746. What came after was not inevitable, but Culloden made it possible. The structures that might have protected the Highland people were now gone. Right, the question I promised at the start. Did the wrong side win at Culloden? I want to be honest about the complexity here, because it is genuinely complicated. The case for the Jacobites is, on the surface, appealing, especially to Scottish hearts. The Stuarts were the Scottish royal dynasty. Culloden was followed by the systematic destruction of Highland culture. A Stuart restoration might, just might, have preserved more of what was lost, and there's an emotional logic to it. But the Jacobite cause was not simply romantic Scottish nationalism. James II was a Catholic monarch in a Protestant country who had demonstrated fairly clearly that he intended to use royal power to override parliamentary and religious settlements that people had fought and died for. The Jacobite cause was backed by France, not because France loved Scotland, but because a Jacobite Britain would have been a weakened Britain, a Britain distracted by internal conflict and friendly to French interests. Scotland was, in part, a pawn in a European power game. And the clan system that the Jacobites sought to preserve was not, if we're being honest, a paradise for ordinary Highlanders. It was a feudal system. The chief had power. The people at the bottom had very little. The romanticism of the clan, like most romanticisms, glosses over a great deal of ordinary hardship. On the other hand, the Hanoverian victory led, within a generation, to the Highland clearances, to the emptying of communities that had existed for thousands of years, to forced emigration on a scale that is still felt today. In the Scottish diaspora communities of Canada and America and New Zealand. The Enlightenment flourished in Edinburgh in the same decades, but in the Glens, something irreplaceable was lost. What I'd say is this: a cause can be imperfect, and its destruction can still be a loss. Both things can be true at the same time. The Jacobite cause had its flaws. The way it ended and what came after was a tragedy. You can hold both of those together. If you go to Culloden today, and I really hope you will, there are simple headstones across the moor, and each one bears a clan name: Fraser, Cameron, MacDonald, Macintosh. They all died there, but they're not forgotten. Okay, so before I let you go, some listener mail. In episode 1, I asked you to send me your Scotland stories, the thing that brought you here or the thing that made you curious, and some of you actually did. First up, we have Elise from Arizona, and she says, I'm from Arizona and I thought I knew what dramatic scenery looked like. Then I drove through Glencoe, and when I just pulled over and sat and looked at it, nothing had prepared me for the scale of the place. Amazing. I know exactly what you mean, Elise. And then we've got Mary Ann from Pennsylvania, and she says, I couldn't tell you what the moment was, honestly. There was no thunderbolt. I just kept finding myself booking another trip and another one and another one. And somewhere around my 4th visit, I thought, oh, this is just my place now. And then finally, Matthew from North Carolina. He says, my gran used to talk about Ayrshire like it was some other planet, somewhere magical she'd left behind. Sadly, she died before I could take her back there, so I went there for her. And honestly, visiting the church where she had been baptised, that was just it for me. Scotland got into me through her. How sweet is that? Thank you to everyone who took the time to drop us an email. Keep sending them in. I really do appreciate it. So, now, your Scots Word of the Week. And this week, it's blether. B-L-E-T-H-E-R. Blether. And it means to chat, to gossip, to talk warm and cheerful nonsense. Ach, away and blether means to go and talk to someone. Having a good old blether is one of life's genuine pleasures. A long conversation that goes nowhere in particular and is all the better for it. I chose it deliberately this week because after everything we've just covered, Culloden, the clearances, 60 minutes that changed Scotland forever, I wanted to end in a word that is the opposite of all that weight. A blether. 2 people, a nice cup of tea, talking about nothing. There's a resilience in that too. Next week on Everything Scotland, we're going somewhere warmer and considerably more aromatic. We're talking about whisky, the water of life, the soul of Scotland. Why there are 130 plus active distilleries, what the 5 whisky regions are, and why they taste completely different from each other. How's it made? And I will sort this one out once and for all. How is it spelled? Here's a hint. There's no E, but we'll get properly into that. I'm Lesley Kennedy. This is Everything Scotland. Slán